Much. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. And I just want to say that the poem is an excellent way to start this evening, and an intensely, almost agonizing reminder of why we are doing what we are doing and why this work is so incredibly important and why everybody needs to be involved in this work, because it can't just be about the people who are likely to be subject to policing, but it's also about those of us for whom these actions by police are being taken. And so I think it's very important, and I'm so glad that people joined the call tonight to learn a little bit more about what's happening with this DOJ investigation. I'll give you a little historical context, but I'll also tell you a lot more about the DOJ investigation that's happening now and why I think it's important, how I think people should get involved. So that's kind of the plan. But again, I want to thank you for that art piece because it profoundly explains why we need to be doing what we're doing and why we need to do even more of it. So thank you for that. So my name is Michelle Gross, and I'm one of the founders and currently the president of the group Communities United Against Police Brutality. And as Emmanuel said, we're an all-volunteer organization. We are in our 21st year, so we are not new at this. We've been doing it for quite a while. And we are always, we do provide advocacy for people dealing with the effects of police brutality. So I work with a lot of families of people who have been killed by police. We do a lot for people who've been brutalized by police, helping them find lawyers, helping them gather evidence in their cases, going to court with people, and all of these kinds of things like that. But we always make it clear that we're about social justice, not social services. So people that want our help actually have to get involved in the work. And by doing that, we both keep the movement going and build a stronger movement, but we also provide that opportunity for individuals who are harmed by policing to regain their sense of personal agency. And I talk about that because it's particularly important to me because I myself am a survivor of police brutality, but it was in a situation in New Orleans where I couldn't get justice. And so I get justice by helping other people get justice. And that's how, again, you regain your sense of personal agency and you regain your sense of power, because being brutalized by police, being a victim of police brutality really takes your power away from you. So this is an important way to get your power back. And so it's important, I think, to talk about those things and to be ready to step up and do things to get your own power back and to empower others. And so that's kind of the way that we operate in Communities United Against Police Brutality. But we're always looking for solutions. We're always looking to solve the problem. We want to educate people about the problem, but we don't want to just go, it's a really bad problem. Isn't that terrible? We need to solve the problem, right? So we're looking always for solutions. And we spend a lot of time looking at evidence-based best practices as solutions. We don't want to go, geez, I think it'd be great if we tried XYZ. We always want to have evidence to see that these solutions are going to work and things like that. So fast cut over to the DOJ. So the Department of Justice is a federal government department. It's a pretty important one. It's one of the largest departments in the country, and they have many functions that they are involved in. The FBI reports to the Department of Justice. There's just lots of functions of the Department of Justice. One of the functions that they have a community relations portion that looks at things like where there's uprisings and things like that. They may come to town and try to address some of what's happening in the community. And that's actually what has happened in Minneapolis in the past. I won't forget, for example, in 2001, roughly, we had a situation, maybe a lot of people are not going to remember this situation, but there was a situation on the north side where Minneapolis police came to a house and attempted to serve a warrant on one of the members of the household. And when they knocked on the door, a young man named Julian Powell, came to the door, and he and his little dog came running out, came up to the door, opened the door. And this was at about 8 o'clock at night in the middle of the summer. So it was, broad daylight, right? And they opened the door, the little dog came running out. The police shot the dog, which they have a bad habit of shooting dogs, by the way, another whole story. But they shot the dog, but when they did, the bullet ricocheted off the step and hit Julian in the arm. Now, he didn't die or anything like that, but he was injured. This caused, and there had been a lot of bad things that had happened on the north side in the recent history around that time period. We had just dealt with another young man who was running away from police, and he was running through people's yards, and the police shot him in the back. And this happened again. It's like 2 in the afternoon, just maybe 2 weeks prior to the Julian Powell shooting. And this guy, people were very up in arms about that. I'd been up in the neighborhood much of the afternoon and evening that night. And then this Julian Powell shooting happened. I got called. I went running up there. I called other people, and several people, community activists and leaders came to that area, and the community was very, very angry. There was a pretty significant uprising. In fact, a media van was torched. Some media, reporters with the Star Tribune, who had traditionally always reported the police side of everything, got brutalized by the community because they were mad at them for, just telling the cop story all the time. And so they ran them out of the neighborhood. Other kinds of things were going on. There was a lot, youth were, throwing rocks at every car that passed through the neighborhood and things like that. So it's a pretty sizable uprising, and it went on. There was fires in the neighborhood. This went on for, like all of the night. And I was up there talking to neighbors, and some of us were trying to, sort of address what was happening and get the cops out of the neighborhood and things like that. And we had been talking to the Department of Justice Community Relations section about federal mediation. So myself and Pauline Thomas, who actually works for Legal Rights Center, and two other women who were lawyers, basically the four of us had been talking to the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Minneapolis. We've been talking to the Department of Justice Community Relations section on federal mediation, and we were asking for federal mediation. And they, once the uprising happened, they were eager to come here and do federal mediation. We started a whole campaign to try to urge the city council and the mayor to approve federal mediation, and for us to be able to have mediation with the city. And the process of doing that, we spent like months having multiple events. I think we had about 25 events altogether, gathering from people. If you were at the mediation table, what would you want to see? And we gathered all of these ideas that people had, turned it into a 10-page community demand document, got ready to go to federal mediation. And then the city said, we're not going to sit with the mediation team because we don't like that you didn't pick the people we wanted for the team. And I should back up and mention that when the community team came together, the way it came together is that we actually invited the whole community to come to Richard Green School, which is this giant, they have this giant auditorium, and we invited people to come and vote for who they wanted to be on the mediation team. So the mediation team was selected by votes. There were a couple of communities that, like the Somali community, that selected their representative themselves in a different way. But nonetheless, these were all communities that put forward their candidates, and all of us were on the team. I voted on the team. And we got ready to mediate, and the city wouldn't sit down with us. They would only sit down with the team that included the people they wanted. So our organization at that point stepped away from mediation because we pretty much knew it was going to be a bogus process, because when the city can pick who they mediate with, they can control the outcome of that mediation. And so we were not going to be part of that. So we ended up doing a class action lawsuit instead. It involved 592 cases that we had gathered from going door to door and talking to people to get ready for the mediation. We also were picking up cases at the same time. And so we put all those cases into a class action lawsuit, and we just announced we're not going to be part of this mediation. We're going to sue the city instead. And it was a successful class action. One of the things it did was put cameras in all the squad cars in Minneapolis, for example. So there was several policy changes that we made happen through that. The mediation went on from about 2002-ish or so, all the way through 2008. And the bottom line, so, about 6 years or a little bit more. And the bottom line was that nothing came out of it, which was really, really shameful. We were having big problems with Minneapolis police even back then, and things did not get better. Pretty soon, there was an outfit called Institute for Trust and Justice that showed up in 2016. Again, another part of this community relations, part of the DOJ, and they did some kind of a study. And crazy, the crazy part is they did a presentation on their study that they did. And when we asked for the actual study itself, they kept telling us, no, this PowerPoint is the report. This PowerPoint is the study. We're like, how can a PowerPoint be a study? You don't have any written documentation? And the crazy part on top of it all is that the numbers they were using were wrong. We knew they were wrong because there were numbers from the Office of Police Conduct Review that we knew, because we have those same numbers, we knew those figures were wrong. And so their conclusions were wrong based on wrong figures, right? And so that pretty much didn't go anywhere. They formed some work groups to implement some of the recommendations of this Office of Justice Procedure, OJP thing. And the work groups met for a little while. I see that some of at least one of the people that's on this call was in one of those work groups. And then after everybody did all the work to come up with implementation plans for the work groups, all those implementation plans went into a file drawer, never to be seen again. So then we'll fast forward to the next year after that, which is 2016. And what showed up then was the Institute for Trust and Justice. Then the Office of Justice Procedure showed up, and they had a bunch more recommendations that also went to a file drawer, and nothing ever happened. So these guys show up and they study us and they come up with ideas and this and that and the other thing, and then things typically don't happen. And that's been a real problem. And the reason that has been a problem is because this is out of the community relations section of the DOJ. They have no enforcement powers. So Minneapolis police like things the way they are. They're not particularly interested in changing. And so when you bring an outfit here that doesn't have enforcement powers, we're not going to have any outcome from that. But so things went along. And of course, we all know that George Floyd was killed, and it was really egregious. And, we became the epicenter for an international movement for a demand to end police violence and, the whole police accountable. So this happened. And in the aftermath of that, the Department of Justice showed up here again, but this time they brought the right people. This time it is the civil litigation section of the DOJ. And what the civil litigation section can do that the community relations section cannot do is enforce their orders. So what they do is they come in and they investigate, and based on their findings, they can say there's nothing wrong, which I don't think there's any possibility of that happening, right? Nobody thinks that's going to happen. But what they will do is, with their findings, that they will craft what's called a consent decree. And a consent decree is like an agreement between the city and the DOJ. And I'm going to tell you in a second why, where we can fit into that agreement. But that agreement then goes to court and becomes a court order. And that court order has enforcement powers. The court then assigns monitors to monitor this agreement. And these agreements typically run 5 or 6 years, in their implementation. And the monitors are to monitor whether or not the implementations are happening. And there's actions that can be taken if they're not, particularly if the city is completely resistant and doesn't adopt the mandates that are in this consent decree. Then the US government, the DOJ, can actually put the police department in receivership, which means they take them over. And we've been saying for years, receivership would not be a bad thing because our Minneapolis Police Department is pretty far out of whack. And I think it's about everybody on this call would probably agree to that. So we're excited. I'm personally excited about the DOJ Civil Litigation Department being here. I've actually been asking for this to happen for over 20 years. And so I feel like strongly it needs to happen. And I'm glad about it. But at the same time, when you look into consent decrees and this process that has happened in many other cities around the country, we've reached out to people in all these different cities like Seattle. And I'm from New Orleans. I know a lot of people in New Orleans. So the New Orleans consent decree, all different consent decrees, Philly, just all different places where these things have happened. Cincinnati, we just had people here talking about the Cincinnati agreement. What you find out is that it can go really well or it can go really badly. And the big deciding factor on whether it goes well or goes badly is how much the community is involved. If you only just let the DOJ kind of go off in a corner and do their work and there's no community input, they're going to get the documents they get from the city, and the city's going to decide what documents to give them, and they're going to come to the wrong conclusion. Much like what happened in that Institute for Trust and Justice thing, where they showed up, the city gave them some documents, they had all the wrong numbers, and the conclusions were wrong. The same thing can happen with this DOJ investigation if we're not careful. So in cities where they've had successful consent decrees, where the consent decrees actually address the underlying problems in the community, that happened because the community was at the table. They were the ones saying what needed to happen. They were the ones sharing their experiences to to really shape the narrative of what's happening, so that the DOJ gets the idea of what's really going on, not what the city's telling you is going on. And so it's very, very important that the community step up and be part of this. And there's key portions of where the community can be a part of this. First of all, right now, we are gathering information from the community on, essentially, we're doing brainstorming. Okay, if you were going to write the consent decree, what would you want included in it? Much like we did with the federal mediation, we are gathering a large list of community demands. And we're modernizing it to the current time period based on what's going on right now. We're not just looking back to those old demands. The second thing we're doing is we need to bring people's experiences to the forefront. The DOJ is very good at taking large spreadsheets full of data, lots of documents, court records, all kinds of things like that. They're very good at taking all of that stuff and analyzing it and crunching it. They've got lots of people that know how to do all that stuff. What they are not very good at, and this is everybody that's had this experience with them says the same thing. What they're not good at is reaching out to the community and gathering their experiences. And they pretty much admit that to you when you meet with them. I've met with the investigators, so probably 5 or 6 times now, and they have community relations. Well, they have like outreach people working with them, but even with that, they're not that good. I mean, they're nice people and everything, but they're just not good at this stuff. And what I mean by that is this: we started having events all around different neighborhoods in parks, so people feel safe, social distance and so forth, and everybody comes and shares their ideas about the consent decree. And, we start to take documentation on their experiences. The DOJ, when I talked to them about that, we were having one of our events virtually and things like that. And they weren't sure that they would be allowed to join that event because they weren't sure if they could, get on the link or something. It was really bizarre. And then another time they said, well, we're going to do an event. We want to do our own event. So we said, great, tell us what it is and all of that stuff. Give me a Facebook event that I can put on our Facebook pages. They said, we're not authorized to use Facebook. I was like, what? I explained to them here that everybody in the movement here uses Facebook, so you need to get authorized. But it was strange, it's like for outreach and community engagement, they don't really have a good idea of how to do it. So we know this now, and we want to make sure. And the other thing is they might not reach enough people. And the kind of third piece of it is this: when somebody says, hi, I'm with the DOJ, I'd like you to talk to me, people are going to be scared out of their minds. What is the DOJ, right? They prosecute people, they are involved in ICE detentions, they're involved in the FBI is under the DOJ, right? People are not going to, just run out and go, yeah, I want to go hang out with the DOJ and talk with them because, we don't know what they're going to do with this, right? So we felt like what needed to have happen here is that the community needs to be the one that gathers these experiences, that gathers the information that people want to share with the DOJ about what needs to happen in the consent decree. And we felt like we needed to organize the community in a way that we would have a strong front, because what is going to happen, and I realize I'm doing a lot of talking right now, I'm going to stop soon, I promise. But what's going to end up happening if we don't do that is, like I said, the city will sit in the corner with the DOJ. They'll make a consent decree that's not based on any reality that we're living in, right? They just, because the city's not trying to have a heavy burden of things that they have to do. So they're going to come up with something that's got no basis in reality for what we need to actually have changed. And the community will not have the strength to be able to go up against that. So what we're doing, like I said, is organizing the community. We are working on retaining attorneys that are going to help us intercede if we need to, because sometimes the community has to sue to be part of the consent decree. Like we might have to put in a motion to be an intervener, the community, and actually put us in. Also, once the consent decree goes to court, there are these things called fairness hearings where you can bring forward things that need to be added to the consent decree. But again, to do that, we might have to actually go into court and petition to be interveners. So we have to be prepared. Like we can't just go, oh gosh, they're not letting us in, let's go find a lawyer. We have to do all of this in the front end and be ready. And so that's actually all of the kinds of stuff that we're working on right now. And to get the community's input in the broadest possible way, like I said, we are having events in all around the city in all different neighborhoods, at parks. We're doing some virtual events and things like that. Our goal is to eventually have about 20 to 25 events. And some of them are going to be, community specific, like we're working with our allies and our colleagues in the Somali community, the Hmong community, the Latino community, different communities like that, where we need to, American Indian community, all the different communities that need to be at the table. We are talking to and having community specific events with those communities. So this is like really important stuff. And then I was kind of telling these folks before our meeting tonight that we've started doing one more thing. We have been hiring people to do canvassing. We are going to make sure that every single neighborhood is canvassed in this city over the next year while this DOJ investigation is going on. We're canvassing people throughout the whole community, and we'll get to every neighborhood. But the neighborhoods where there's been the biggest problems, we know we're talking about North Minneapolis, Phillips, other neighborhoods like that where there's been the biggest problems with policing. We will repeatedly canvass those neighborhoods to try to gather people's experiences. And frankly, one of the kind of strategies is that if the city and the DOJ do not come up with a good consent decree, we're going to have these experiences as backup, not only to share with the DOJ and all, but we're going to turn into lawsuits. And we'll sue. We'll do what we did with the federal mediation. We will have a lawsuit in the offing, that if they're not going to let the community be at the table and in a meaningful way and have our, our recommendations be part of this consent decree, then hey, we'll just sue you, and that'll be our leverage. So this is kind of like the work that's being done. But I see this from my perspective as somebody doing this work for about 34 years, I see this as some of the most important work I've ever done. Our organization is all in on this work. We are literally making it our top priority for the next, long haul, over at least a year of the DOJ investigation and then some, because once the monitoring starts, you've really got to pay attention then, because they will, again, everything depends on the quality of the monitor that you have. I want to throw in one more piece about that. And then I swear I'll shut up and answer any questions people have. So monitors is an interesting thing. The court appoints them and they get paid, and it's a lucrative business. In the Cincinnati monitoring, the monitors for the first year, that monitoring went on for 6 years. And the first year of it, they got paid $5 million. So it was a real, there was a lot of money involved in this thing. So what happens is it sprung up a whole little cottage industry of these little corporations and law firms and so forth that like to do monitoring. And so some of these are like Jones Day is a law firm. They're the fourth largest law firm in the country, by the way, or actually in the world. And they're also a law firm that took all of the lawsuits on behalf of Donald Trump to court to try to overturn the results of the election. So they're an interesting law firm. They're big, right? I think they're what I would almost call apolitical, like they don't care, they'll represent anybody, right? But they've shown up in the city of Minneapolis, and they've got 20 lawyers working at Minneapolis for free, doing all of this processing of complaints in the Office of Police Contract Review and doing stuff with the Federation contract and all kinds of things like that they're doing for free. They've shown up. Another outfit called Hillard Hines has shown up, and they're an outfit that has done a lot of monitoring in other cities or tried to. And right now what they're doing is they're doing an after action report for the city on the uprising. And where we've researched their after action reports in other cities, and all of those have failed to mention any harm to any activists, any lawsuits as a result of those harms, any violations of people's civil rights. It's almost like the perspective is all the perspective from the city and the cops. And so we already know what this outfit's about. That outfit, Hillard Hines, showed up in New Orleans to try to be the monitors for that consent decree. And they built it, and what they do is they put together these teams, and the team that they brought forward was all of these discredited cops out of Chicago that had been part of what was called the Burge torture, controversy, or the Burge torture, I don't know what you want to call it, the crime. There was a group of cops that engaged in widespread torture of African-American men and sent a lot of innocent men to prison for a long time, and youth, kids, and everything. And some of these cops have been involved in that, and they would put them on this monitoring team for New Orleans. And the community soundly and roundly and appropriately rejected that team and got rid of them by doing their research. So we've got some of these, sort of 3 of these agencies like that are swirling around the city right now, doing all this little volunteer work and all this stuff, because we think they're lining themselves up to be the monitors for this. And so we have to watch this process carefully and make sure that we object to them as monitors, because none of them have a good history of doing a proper job of monitoring in the cities where they've been selected. So we are actually hoping that, you know, a group of lawyers will become the monitors. That's what ended up happening in New Orleans, a group of civil rights attorneys, and the monitoring down there is being done extremely well, excellent. And not only is it going well down there, but their process involves reviewing the consent decree every 3 months with several community meetings. And so the community is at the table for that monitoring as well. And so that's the model that we're looking at. But honestly, you know, that's why the community's got to be engaged and be part of this. Because if you're not paying attention, they're doing stuff that's going to harm you in the background. I'm not necessarily saying that about the DOJ, but we know what the city's about, right? So we've got to be ready to jump in with both feet and, you know, have proper legal representation, have the proper research done around these different agencies that think they're going to come in and be the monitors. All of this kind of stuff is part and parcel of this process. So while the DOJ is here, they're not our saviors. They can do some helpful things, but they're not our saviors. But they can be much more helpful if we are our own saviors and jump in and do what we need to do. So that's kind of my message for you tonight. And I'm hoping you all have lots of good questions, and I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm pretty sure you are just like the expert on this, and you have such good information. I'm very impressed with just everything that you know, and you're able to keep track of all these many moving parts. Can you possibly give a broad timeline or kind of a high level view of really what our next steps are?
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. So the DOJ is saying that their investigation is going to last 9 to 12 months. And as I've been talking to the investigators, they're thinking it's more on the 12-month side, because there is a lot to look at here. And there's a lot of things, you know, like we're trying to make sure. So let me start back, just to take one step back. When they came to us, what they said was they're going to investigate 3 areas. They're going to look at excessive force against the community and against protesters. You know, they're going to definitely look at that piece. They're going to look at general patterns of discrimination, like, you know, racial profiling in traffic stops, things of that nature. And then they're going to look at discrimination against disabled people, particularly people experiencing a mental health, you know, disability. And so that was another area that they, you know, 3 areas that they're going to look at. And I'm glad for those 3 areas. We have asked them to look at 2 additional areas. One is that we've asked them to look at Minneapolis police treatment of unsheltered homeless people. Particularly, we're thinking about like the way that police show up at the encampments. Very brutal, very brutal. You know, they show up at 5 a.m. with, you know, bulldozers and bulldoze people's property, steal people's property, you know, just the whole bad treatment of unsheltered homeless people. And then we've asked them to look at one additional area, and that's this. We've asked them to look into the lack of meaningful investigation into community violence against people of color, particularly murders. What we know about murders that happen to people of color in Minneapolis is that the Minneapolis Police Department's homicide unit does an extremely poor job of investigating those cases. In one case that I'm working with, for example, the homicide showed up on the scene and said, "Oh, she's Mexican, right?" And then they left. So we know that there's problems with discrimination related to the way that these homicides are being addressed or not addressed, really, if you want to say it. So I'm working with about a dozen families whose family members, you know, were killed, people of color whose family members were killed and never had any real investigation at all. So, so that's another area that we asked them to look into in terms of, you know, Minneapolis police patterns and practices. And so what they're looking at, and I should say something about that real quick, Minneapolis, when they do these investigations, they're looking for patterns and practices. So, you know, they're not looking at kind of one-off situations. They're looking at the kinds of patterns and practices that led to, for example, to George Floyd dying, right, being killed. And so to establish patterns and practices. They're going to look at lots of data. Like I said, they're good at that. But really, we need to bring our experiences forward because those are the most concrete examples that allow them to develop an understanding of the patterns and practices of the Minneapolis police. They're the concrete examples that seal the deal, because you can have a policy that says, oh, we're not going to bother people that are taping us, it's okay, whatever. But if Minneapolis police are seizing everybody's, cell phones, right, when they get taped, then that's the actual pattern and practice. Policy can be one thing, pattern and practice is a different thing. And people's experiences actually shore up or really establish what those patterns and practices are. So that's why it's got to be, we've got to really work on getting that to people. And like I said, we've got, they're going to be here 9 to 12 months on the investigation. Once we've gotten all the information to them, then it's probably another 6 months or so to put together the consent decree and go through the court process. And then the consent decrees quite typically last 5 years. Some communities have gone, for example, in Cincinnati, they didn't feel like all of their, demands got addressed in 5 years. So they went to court and got a court order to extend the consent decree for another year. So that's kind of, so we're talking about long haul here. This isn't like, wave a magic wand and solve all the problems tomorrow afternoon. It's not going to happen like that. We got real work to do.
Thank you, Michelle. And it looks like there's a question from Linda in the chat. I don't know if you can read that.
Yep, I'm seeing it. I see part of it anyway.
Okay, so yeah, it says, is the DOJ going to look at the relationship between private companies like Target and the Hennepin County and Minneapolis Police Department? I thought Target wanted to keep certain people out of Nicollet Mall.
That is a great question. And it's one of the things we are urging them to look at. We're urging them to look at a few things, to look at, the way the Minneapolis police conducts themselves in all those areas I talked about, but also to look at this kind of public-private partnership that Minneapolis has come up with. One of the things is, I call it the privatization of police accountability. They don't have any people in the community actually doing anything about police accountability. Everything's all of these private outfits like Jones Day and Hillard Hines and all these other people that show up. The community, there's no space for the community to be involved. And consequently, when that kind of situation happens, then the framing of what needs to be held accountable for, what the problems are, is framed strictly from this part of the city, and then they feed it to these people, and then these people come up with, so-called solutions based on that. And so we are concerned about that privatization. We're certainly concerned about the sort of city, and private entity alliances around public safety. Some of that is also, an experience we're concerned about related to these city paid groups. That's a whole different ballgame. We can go into that if people want to, but but Target's a big one because they provide a lot of resources for the police that manipulate the way police do their business, so to speak. How they control downtown and so forth and so on. That's a big one. I want to mention one other thing we're asking them to look into, not just Minneapolis. We are saying you need to be across the river in St. Paul. You need to be looking at Brooklyn Center, which has killed somebody every year and a half. For a department of 42 officers, that's appalling. You need to be looking at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which is the agency that all the police departments are now using to investigate police critical incidents. And they're so problematic because they do an extremely poor job of these investigations, an extremely poor job. And frankly, having reviewed many of these investigations, I can tell you they are literally a whitewash. There's nothing credible about their investigations. And we've got the data to back that up because we do our own investigations into police critical incidents and can show how they whitewash this stuff. So we're asking them to look into the BCA as well. So seeing a few other questions in the chat. Let me see if I can roll up and see them a little better.
Yep. The first one, yeah, it looks like it's about receivership.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Like,
so receivership only happens if the city fails to meaningfully implement the consent decree. And they give them some pretty good chances to do it. They don't go on the first, on the first slip up, they don't come in and smack them down. They give them some more chances, and they, will modify the timeline of the consent decree in different ways and this and that. provide them with resources and expertise to help them comply and so forth. But if the city is stubborn in complying, they will put them into receivership. And that literally means that the DOJ sends in their folks to take over our police department. Basically, the chief is kind of put on leave. I mean, it's not, like an employment leave, but it's like basically the chief is no longer running the department. The city's no longer running it. The DOJ will run it with their own people. And this has actually happened 3 times, believe it or not, in Philadelphia. So Philadelphia's been under receivership 3 times. And it's like the sheriff coming to town and cleaning up Dodge. They just come in and, fire people that need to be fired. They change all the policies. They retrain everybody, set the expectations, and then they stay for a while to make sure that it sticks. So some of these receiverships last 3-4 years. Okay, so let's see what else we have on here. I'm sorry, I should be reading these questions. Okay, oh yeah, what line is crossed? Okay, I think I kind of answered that. Basically, a stubborn refusal to implement the consent decree will get us a receivership. I've kind of been saying for years, I think we needed to be in receivership, clean up their act and start all over again. But we'll see if the city's able to comply with the consent decree. But more importantly, we're going to make it a strong one so that they have to comply to something that's worth complying to, that really gives us what we need. And let's see. Oh, and the other question is, what does it look like? What does community control and accountability look like when the police department's under receivership? And this is what's an interesting question. I really like this question. What ends up happening is they also look at, like, one of the things, for example, the DOJ is looking at right now is our accountability mechanisms in Minneapolis, which is a very good thing because those are very problematic. People will remember that golly, it's like probably more like 23, 24 years ago, Lloyd Smalley and Lillian Weiss were killed. This was an elderly couple, and I think it was like 98 or 99, something like that. They were killed, and because the Minneapolis police were serving a warrant for, like, I think their grandson or something, and he didn't even live in the house, but they threw a flash grenade into the house and incinerated this elderly couple to death. I mean, a really horrible killing. And the community got very up in arms, as they well should, and demanded civilian oversight. And so civilian review was formed. And that went on for several years, and they never gave them enough money, enough power, enough investigators. They always kept it really starved for resources and starved for power. So it wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but it was civilian. It was actual civilians doing it. Actual members of the community, and it was very separate from the police department. Well, back in 2012, the city decided that they'd had enough of that, and they decided to get rid of the civilian oversight and implement this thing called the Office of Police Conduct Review. That's the place you go now to file against complaints against the police. Here's the deal, though. That agency, which they try to pretend is civilian oversight, has no civilians to it. It's all run jointly by city staff and the police department. So this is that agency. And in the 8 years, in the first 8 years, it's I've got newer statistics, but I haven't updated my numbers on it yet. But in their 8 years of existence, they have taken in 3,434 complaints. They have disciplined 20. That's a 0.58% disciplinary, rate, when the national average for civilian oversight is 7 to 8%. So we're like sitting around 0.5%, right? And I mean, it's just over 0.5%. It's like horrendous, right? We're like the low end outlier for the whole country. So the DOJ will look at that, right? And they will say, your oversight mechanisms are not adequate. I mean, I'm really hoping for them to say that, and they need to say that. And we've been sharing with them our data to make sure that they say that, because we actually have more data on all these issues than the city does, because the city gets rid of their data after a certain amount of time because of their retention schedule. And CUAPB's retention schedule is never. We keep it for forever and ever, right? So we've got 21 years worth of data on the Minneapolis police. And so, they're going to look at that oversight mechanism. And part of receivership will be putting, if it gets to the point of receivership, would be putting into place a much more robust and appropriate mechanism for civilian oversight of the police and, for accountability and control. They'll look at the way that internal affairs is operated, And right now, the way it's operated in Minneapolis is that if you want to get promoted to a higher rank in the police department, all people that are like sort of in the management grooming process get run through internal affairs for a period of time. So they all get like run through internal affairs. So instead of having professionals that run internal affairs all the time, they have these people that kind of rotate in and out that are going to come back and have to work with other cops that they might have investigated. So they are highly motivated not to do a doggone thing, right? Because you're going to have to go back and work with these guys again, and you were acting like a rat or snitch or whatever these people feel like internal affairs does, right? And so right now, between internal affairs and the Office of Police Conduct Review, we pretty much have no real oversight body that's actually independent and that actually does a good job. I mean, it's just pretty bad. So if there were to be receivership, one of the things that they would do is, as a part of that process, is they would develop an actual internal affairs mechanism and probably work with the community for a civilian oversight mechanism so that when they get done, they leave something better in place. And so that's kind of the way receivership works, but it's a harsh remedy. For them, they consider it to be the harshest remedy. And so that's, Minneapolis is going to want to basically at least marginally cooperate with the consent decree to avoid that.
I'm going to thank you for answering those. I know there's more questions and thoughts in the chat. I just want to make sure we have a good amount of time in our breakout room. So it's 6:20 right now. We want about a half an hour to let folks chat. So I'm going to put people in just randomized breakout rooms. And Michelle, we'd love to have you join one if you want to. And we can discuss things further, and then we'll come back together as a group and just give about 10 minutes to kind of chat about what we each talked about in our respective groups. And if there's any lingering questions, I know you have to be off the call by 7, so we'll make sure to respect that time limit as well, Michelle. So just give me 1 second here and I will put together these breakout groups.